I've spent countless nights sitting in quiet rooms where the only sound is the steady, rhythmic ticking of a clock or the soft, mechanical hum of a monitor. It's a very specific kind of silence that takes over during those final hours, one that most people find heavy and unsettling. Families usually sit in the corner, looking at their loved one with eyes closed and no response to a touch or a whisper, assuming the person they know is already gone. They see a total shutdown, a literal void where a connection used to be. But I've learned that this silence is rarely ever empty. I remember a man who hadn't moved a muscle in over 48 hours. His children were whispering nearby, already talking about him in the past tense, sharing old memories as if he were already miles away. But then, a specific song started playing on the small radio by the bed. Right at the chorus, his hand gave a tiny, deliberate twitch. It wasn't a random reflex or a muscle spasm. It felt like a clear, conscious answer to the music. In that moment, the atmosphere in the room shifted instantly because it became clear that he was still there, just in a way they didn't understand. We often interpret a lack of movement as a total absence, a sign that the light has already been turned off. But after years of watching these patterns, I've realized something that changes the way we look at the end of life. What looks like a body failing is often something much more complex and intentional. It's as if the energy is being pulled inward, focusing on a final, internal process that we simply haven't been taught to see. What if that silence isn't a void of abandonment, but a period of intense transition that we are completely misinterpreting? I watched the daughter lean in, her voice breaking as she called out his name, but there was nothing, not even a flicker of an eyelid. To her, it felt like she was talking to an empty shell, a body that had already checked out while the heart was still stubbornly beating. She looked at me with a haunting mix of grief and confusion, silently asking if he could still feel her hand. It's a moment where everyone feels suspended in a painful, unanswered question. There's a specific tension that comes from not knowing if this stillness is peaceful or a sign of hidden struggle. I've seen family members pull back, almost afraid to touch the skin because it feels so disconnected from the person they love. They start to wonder if something is going wrong, if the silence is actually a form of suffering we can't measure. But then you see a small, inexplicable change in the breathing that doesn't follow any medical logic, making you question if something else is happening. This is the exact point where most people look away, assuming the story has already ended, but it's actually where the most fascinating part begins. We've been taught that unresponsiveness is just a slow fade into darkness, yet the patterns I've witnessed suggest the opposite. There is a very specific reason why the body chooses this total external shutdown, and it isn't because it's giving up. What if this void is actually a highly active state, and those tiny movements are keys to a hidden process? You notice the breath first. It isn't the steady, unconscious rhythm we use to navigate our daily lives. Instead, it becomes a series of long, hollow pauses, followed by deep, sighing gasps that seem to come from deep within the chest. To a family member watching, it looks like a desperate struggle for air, a body fighting a losing battle. But when you look closer, there is no panic. The face is strangely smooth, almost as if they are listening to a distant sound. I've tried to reach patients in this state, gently calling their name or touching their arm, but it's like they've locked the door from the inside. They might have their eyes half open, staring at a fixed point on the ceiling, yet they don't blink when you move your hand. It feels like a profound withdrawal, a total redirection of their internal focus. You begin to wonder if they've already left, but then you see a single, quiet tear roll down a calm cheek. We often call this stage unresponsiveness, but that word is far too simple for what is actually occurring. It implies a mechanical failure, yet what I see is a deliberate transition. Even though they don't squeeze your hand back, their vital signs often react to a familiar voice, even when the rest of the body remains perfectly still. It's a paradox of being completely distant and yet intensely present. But here's the part that most people miss, and it changes how we view every final breath. I've seen so many families lean over the bed, their faces tight with a kind of terror that's hard to watch. They see their loved one's mouth slightly open, or they hear that heavy, congested sound in the chest that we often call the death rattle, and they immediately think of drowning or suffocation. It looks like a struggle, a desperate fight to keep the body going against its will. They beg me for more medication, convinced that every loud breath is a cry for help that the patient can no longer vocalize. But here is the truth that changes the entire atmosphere of the room. What looks like agony to us is almost never felt that way by them. We project our own fear of breathlessness onto a body that has already moved past the need for control. When I look at their faces, I don't see the tension of pain. I see muscles that have finally let go of a lifetime of holding on. It's a profound physiological shift where the brain is essentially cushioning the transition. Yet we interpret this piece as a crisis. It's the ultimate contrast between what we see and what they are actually experiencing. We assume something has gone wrong because the body is no longer behaving normally. But in reality, everything is going exactly as it should. This isn't a failure of care or a sign of hidden torture. It's a necessary, quiet recalibration of the spirit. But if they aren't suffering, what exactly is happening during those long, silent gaps between breaths? That's where the real mystery of the transition begins to reveal itself. You begin to notice that the breathing follows a very specific, almost mathematical pattern. It moves in waves, like a tide that is slowly pulling away from the shore. There will be long moments where everything goes perfectly still, stretches of 20 or 30 seconds where no air moves at all. And then, just as you think it's over, they take a deep, sighing breath. It looks like a struggle, but it's actually the body finding a new, internal equilibrium. The rhythm is slowing down in a way that is incredibly organized. At the same time, the circulation starts to shift in a way that changes how they look and feel. You'll see the hands and feet start to turn a pale, bluish-purple color, a mottled pattern that creeps up the legs. It's easy to assume they are cold or shivering, but they aren't. This is the body being remarkably efficient, pulling all its warmth and blood away from the edges and toward the vital organs in the center. What we see as a loss of color is actually a profound internal focus. The most confusing part is the total withdrawal from the outside world. It feels like the person has entered a deep sleep that they simply cannot be woken from, no matter how much you call their name. We often label this as unresponsiveness, but that suggests a total absence that I don't think is actually there. They aren't gone. They've simply closed the door to the external world to focus on the work happening inside. Hearing is often the last sense to fade, even when the body stays perfectly still. When you see these signs happening together, the rhythmic breathing, the cooling skin, and the deep internal focus, you start to realize this isn't a chaotic failure. It's a sequence. Every body seems to have an ancient, built-in map for this journey, and the landmarks are surprisingly consistent. It looks like a body breaking down, but it's actually a body performing its final, most graceful act of letting go. Understanding this pattern changes everything, because once you see the logic in the silence, the fear starts to lose its grip. I remember a man who hadn't moved a muscle or acknowledged a single person for over 48 hours. His children were sitting in the corner, whispering in low tones, already talking about him in the past tense, as if he were already miles away. They saw a shell, a body that had essentially given up, and the grief in the room was heavy with the feeling of abandonment. To them, the silence was absolute, a sign that their father had already checked out of his own life. But as a specific old song started playing on a small radio nearby, something happened that defied every clinical expectation. Right at the chorus, his hand gave a tiny, deliberate twitch that wasn't a random reflex or a muscle spasm. It was timed perfectly with the music, a clear and conscious answer to a melody he loved. In an instant, the atmosphere shifted from a funeral-like stillness to a moment of electric, undeniable connection. He was still in there, just behind a door we didn't know how to open. The family froze, their eyes widening as they realized that the void they were mourning was actually an illusion. This is the moment that changes your entire perspective on unresponsiveness. It wasn't a total shutdown, but a redirection of his energy. We often assume that because someone isn't looking at us, they aren't experiencing us. But this proves the internal world remains active and vibrant. The silence isn't a sign of a person leaving, but of someone deeply focused on a process we are only beginning to understand. It makes you wonder how many other connections are missed simply because we aren't patient enough to wait for those microscopic signals. We see a body failing and assume the mind has followed. Yet these proofs suggest the consciousness is often the last thing to let go. This isn't just about one-hand twitch. It's about the realization that the end of life is a highly active internal state. But if they are still present, Why does the body choose such a total external withdrawal? The answer reveals the true purpose of the silence. We've spent so much time fearing this silence, looking at the stillness as if it were a wall between us and the person we love. But what if we've been looking at it entirely backward? This unresponsiveness isn't a loss of connection. It is the body's most profound act of protection. It is a quiet, sacred space where the noise of the world is finally filtered out, allowing the soul to focus on the only thing that matters. When you see it this way, the fear of the void transforms into a deep, comforting respect. Knowing they are held in this internal cocoon changes the energy of the room from mourning to gentle accompaniment. We aren't watching someone disappear. We are witnessing them arrive at a place of ultimate rest. This understanding doesn't just take away the sting of the unknown. It gives us the grace to be present without the need to fight. It turns terror into a moment of profound, quiet beauty. If you felt this shift or have a story of your own, please share it below as we continue exploring these mysteries together. In the end, the silence isn't an ending at all. It is a breath held in anticipation of something much larger than we can imagine. It is the peace that finally surpasses our understanding.